In the tannery shop, the kingdom of Erich Grünke, after Konrad Lang, imprisonment in the bunker, the commando of sculptors and selected carpenters was in a crisis. Tadek Myszkowski, the second in command after the capo, has found himself in a difficult position. The spiteful and piercing glare of a wild beast, Erich, replaced Konrad's gentle gaze. Soon, bent on putting an end to everything that Konrad had created and calling the sculptor's workshop a luxury, he closed it down, forcing us to make spoons. He gave us a mean idiot for a capo, nicknamed Hulajnoga, Scooter, identity unknown. He told the carpenters who used to make artistic caskets to switch to wardrobes and the simplest of things. We were making 5 spoons a day, then 7, and eventually 12 spoons a day. Meanwhile, 104, Józef Putek, a former MP, was working here. At that time I recruited colleagues 105, Edward Berlin, 106, identity unknown, 107, identity unknown, a former soldier of my partisan group, 1939. 108, Stanisław Dobrowolski, and second lieutenants 109, identity unknown, 110, Andrzej Gąsienica-Makowski, and 111, identity unknown. Out of the colleagues painting the toys that we had been making were Colonel 62, Jan Karcz, used to work shortly before his imprisonment in the bunker. Officer Cadet 112, Stanisław Jaster, entered our organization, sent to me by Captain 8, Ferdynand Trojnicki, who had been released from the camp. At that point, we had seized control of all the commandos except for one. Finally, in February 1942, when I was a kommandiert and coming back to the camp rather late, having reached the block, I was told by 61 Konstanty Piekarski that 68 Mieczysław Januszewski had paid me a visit earlier on. The Funkstelle needed 2 cartographers, so 61 gave him his number and the number of our former commander, 113, Franciszek Sokołowski. After a couple of days, it turned out that 113, Franciszek Sokołowski's hand was shaking, so we moved him to the SS potato peeling commando. He had enough food there, and I took his place in the Funkstelle. After having discussed it with 52, Tadeusz Myszkowski, in the wood carving shop. We worked on the maps in the Funkstelle with 61, Konstanty Piekarski, for a couple of weeks. The radio station was not only a place of work for SS men. Courses were also being run there. During this time, after having assessed the situation thanks to 77, Zbigniew Ruszczyński, I managed to procure tubes and other parts that we had been looking for a long time. From the spare parts that our prisoners had access to, after 7 months, we built our own broadcasting station, operated by 2nd Lieutenant 4, Alfred Stursel. We put it in a place which the SS men were very reluctant to enter. In the autumn of 1942, the big mouth of one of our colleagues forced us to dismantle the station. We had been broadcasting programs repeated by other stations, information regarding the number of Zugangs and deaths in the camp, the conditions and the state of the prisoners. The camp's authorities were raging, searching, tearing up floors in the workshop and in the Industriehof 1 and in the warehouses. Since our broadcasts were few and far between and had no fixed schedule, finding us was no easy task. After some time, the authorities gave up and moved their search outside the camp, to the town of Oświęcim. They thought that precise information from the camp was the result of our contact with some external organization with civilian workers serving as middlemen. They started to look in the Gemeinschaftslager, and we did indeed have contact with the civilians. The route to reach us led through the civilian population. There were members of our organization among them as well, in Gdzie. It also led through the Gemeinschaftslager, through the people who seemed to have been our superiors, but were in fact working for us. The route also led through Buna, through the contact with civilian workers. This way, I also managed to release a whole package of German encrypting abbreviations known as the Werkersabkürzungen, stolen from the Funkstelle. We were receiving anti-typhoid drugs from the outside. From the one side, Dr. II, Władysław Dering, was working on it. From the other, my colleague, 59, Henryk Bartosiewicz. 59, Henryk Bartosiewicz was a peculiar colleague. Everything he did in a cheerful manner, and always succeeded. He gave sanctuary and food to several colleagues in his room, and in the tannery until they could handle themselves again. He would constantly take people into the tannery. He was always going all the way with courage, even with some nerve, into places where other people would give up. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a bright face and big heart, Himmler arrived once, with a commission. 59 was a room foreman in Block 6, old numbering back then, and he had been instructed how to report to Himmler. Maybe what saved him was the fact that there were 2 civilians of some kind with Himmler, and such gentle treatment of a prisoner made good publicity. Yet, another time in the tannery, 59, seeing through a courtyard window a commission which was visiting the workshops and heading for the door to the great hall where all the tanners had been working, grabbed a hose, and, as if cleaning by spewing water all over the room, he intentionally and completely drenched a group of German officers. Pretending to be in great awe, he instantly dropped the hose and stood to attention, and he got away with it. Again. As the serried ranks of prisoners came back to the camp, drowning in the depths of grim thoughts, 59 would give commands in Polish, shouting loud and clear, raz, dwa, trzy. He certainly had his flaws, but show me a man without them. In any case, he always had a circle of friends and allies nearby. He impressed them and could be a leader for many. The last discharges took place in March 1942. Several colleagues from the orchestra were released, since the commandant, as I have mentioned, liked music and had earned the favor of the Berlin authorities. He was allowed to release several musicians from the orchestra every year. The musicians were told whoever played well would be released from the camp, and so the musicians played beautifully, and the commandant would get drunk on their music. Each year, though, those who were the least needed in the orchestra were released. After March, throughout the whole of 1942, there were no discharges at all. Having any witnesses to the horrors of Auschwitz roaming free outside the camp was extremely undesirable, especially considering what started to take place there that year. Finally, the first women were brought into Auschwitz, to the part separated from us by a high wall, prostitutes and criminals from German prisons. They were made the educational staff for the women, who were soon to be brought here for decent women, political offenders. Every day in Reichsbirkenau, in the gas chambers that had already been finished, the first mass gassings were taking place. On March 16th, 1942, they brought in 120 Polish women. They were smiling at the prisoners who were entering the camp in columns. After the interrogation, or maybe some special kind of torment which was impossible to determine, in the evening of that day, wagons left to the crematorium. full of dismembered corpses, with cut-off heads, arms, breasts, mutilated cadavers. The old crematorium did not have the capacity to keep incinerating the corpses from both the central camp and from Rajsko. The chimney built in 1940 had cracked and collapsed from the constant exposure to the fumes from burning corpses, and a new one was constructed. Because of that, the corpses had to be buried in wide trenches dug by commandos of Jews. 2 new electric crematoriums were built post-haste in Rajsko-Birkenau. The plans were made in the Baubureau. According to colleagues from that office, each crematorium had 8 slots. Each of them could take 2 corpses at the same time. Electrical incineration. 3 minutes. The plans were sent to Berlin. They came back approved, with an order to have the construction finished by February 1st. Later on, the deadline was postponed to March 1st, and in March, the crematoriums were ready. The factory started to work at full capacity. An order to destroy all the evidence of all the murders which had taken place up until that moment was received. The corpses, which had already been buried, had to be dug up again, and there were tens of thousands of them. The corpses were already decomposing. The air was very heavy in the proximity of these great mass graves. Some of them, the older ones, had to be dug up while wearing a gas mask. The degree of work in this hell on earth was enormous. Over 1,000 victims from new transports were being gassed every day, and their corpses incinerated in new crematoriums. Cranes were employed to remove the corpses from the ditches. Giant iron claws were piercing into the mass of the dead, causing small fountains of rancid pus to shoot skyward here and there. Chunks of dead flesh, torn by the cranes from the piles of corpses, were manually transported onto huge pyres constructed from layers of wood and human remains. These pyres were set ablaze, sometimes after being liberally sprinkled with gasoline. They continued to smolder for days and nights at a stretch for 2.5 months, spreading the stench of burnt meat and human bones around Auschwitz. Commandos doing the work consisted solely of Jews and had a lifespan of 2 weeks. After this time, they were gassed as well, and their bodies were added to the piles of bodies that other Jews who had just arrived at the camp had to burn. These new Jews, forming new commandos, did not know that they only had 2 more weeks to live, and clung to some hope of survival. Chestnut and apple trees were blooming beautifully. It was in spring, when the slavery was particularly painful. While marching to the tannery on the grey dusty road, one could see the brilliant sunrise, fine pink blossoms on the orchards and on trees by the road. On the way back to camp, one would meet young couples walking a walk, admiring the delightful charm of the spring, or women pushing their babies in their prams. These situations were bound to summon a fluttering thought, fading in and out of one's inner world, desperately looking for a way out, or an answer to the insoluble question, are we all human? Both those taking a stroll amidst the flowers and those going to the gas chambers too. Those marching next to us with bayonets, and we, for several years now, nothing but lost, forfeited souls. The first larger transports of women were brought into the camp and accommodated in separated blocks, numbers 1 to 10, new numbering. Soon after that, transport after transport after transport of German, Jewish, and Polish women would roll in. They were all put under the command of criminals, prostitutes, and convicted felons. Except for the Germans, all the women had their heads and bodies shaved by our male barbers. Their agitation and desires were soon transformed into frustration, for their lust could not ever be satisfied, despite the distasteful abundance of women around. The women found themselves in the same situation as the men inmate. They did not, however, experience the same fast methods of killing people as we did in the first year of the camp's existence, since the methods had long changed in the male camp as well. Rain, cold, the type of labor they were not used to, the lack of rest and standing to attention interminably were killing them just as they were killing us, though. We saw the same groups of women every day, passing by them, each group headed in different directions to work. A man could recognize some silhouettes, heads, pretty little faces. These initially brave, beautiful beings soon lost the glint in their eyes, the smile on their faces, the spring in their step. Some of them kept smiling, but those smiles were growing more and more gloomy. The faces turned gray, and almost bestial hunger reposed in their gaze. They were becoming Musulmaner. More and more often, we would notice that some of the familiar figures were no longer to be seen in their fives. Rows of women marching to their doom through labor were escorted by people resembling human beings, dressed in the heroic uniforms of German soldiers and a whole pack of dogs. In the field, 2 heroes, or sometimes just one, with several dogs, kept an eye on 100 women. The women, already feeble, could only dream of escaping. Starting from the spring 1942, the infirmary started to readily admit all the Musulmaner who, as before, were still gathering in a group in front of the kitchen to be inspected. Later on, nobody did that anymore. Everyone just went to the infirmary to block 28, new numbering, where, without further fuss, they were admitted. Things got better in the camp. The prisoners would say to each other, "They don't beat us, they admit us to the infirmary," etc. And indeed, sometimes several people would have to share the same bed in the infirmary, but new patients were still being admitted. Every day, Josef Clare, a SS man, would write down the numbers of particular weaker prisoners. It was said that these patients were going to be given extra rations of food. These noted numbers were then read out loud and the prisoners directed to block 20, new numbering. Soon, one could see the corpses marked with these very numbers among the corpses piling up in front of the infirmary. Upon his admittance to the infirmary, each prisoner had his number written in chemical pencil across his chest, on the skin, in huge digits. This was to make sure that there would be no problem with identifying the dead when marked a daily list of those who had died or were murdered. Fennel, that was the new instrument of murder. Yes, the image of Auschwitz underwent some radical changes. Nobody was, at least in the Stammlager, smashing heads open with a shovel or killing people by impaling them on stakes, or by jumping on the chests of prisoners who were made to lie down in plain sight. Now, ribs were not broken under the weight of the bodies of the depraved tormentors who crushed prisoners under their heavy boots. Now, silent, calm, and naked, the prisoners having their numbers recorded in the infirmary by a German SS doctor would stand in the hallway of block 20, new numbering, and patiently wait their turn. One by one, they were stepping beyond the curtain, marking the entrance to the bathroom and sitting on a chair. 2 henchmen would grab their arms from behind, push their chests forward, and an SS man called Claire would inject the fennel with a long needle syringe straight into their hearts. Intravenous injections were used at the beginning, but since the victim lived for a couple of minutes after that, which was too long, in order to save time, the system was changed. After having been injected in the heart, the prisoner was only alive for a couple of seconds. The twitching half-corpse was then thrown into the toilet in the next room, and another soon-to-be-dead number entered. Yes, this manner of murdering was much more clever and yet much more monstrous in its workings. Everyone standing in the hallway knew their fate very well. Walking by them, one could see familiar faces in the row and say, "Cheers, Yash," or "Hi there, Stash. Today, you. Tomorrow, maybe me." One did not have to be seriously ill or exhausted. Some were only being sent here because Claire did not like them, so their numbers were put on the list for the needle. There was no way out. The torturers were different than those in the camp's early days, but I do not know if one can refrain from calling them degenerates. Claire was murdering with the great passion, using his needle, with madness in his gaze and the smile of a sadist putting a mark on a wall after each kill. In my time, he had reached the number of 14,000 people murdered, and every day he kept boasting about it with great satisfaction, like a hunter telling stories about his trophies. Somewhat fewer prisoners, about 4,000, were killed by inmate Pańszczyk, Mieczysław Pańszczyk, who had volunteered to inject poison into his fellow inmates' hearts, and by that he brought great disgrace on himself. Claire had an incident. One time, when he had already killed everyone in the queue, he entered the toilet as usual in order to admire his handiwork in the form of piles of corpses and almost dead prisoners in agony. One such corpse came to life. Apparently there must have been an inaccuracy in the operation, and he must have been given not enough fennel, rose, and stumbling as if drunk walked over the corpses of his other inmates, approaching Claire and saying, "Du hast mir zu wenig gegeben, gib mir noch etwas." Claire's face turned pale, but he did not lose grip of himself. He charged at the prisoner, and the mask of fake sophistication and executioner fell. Claire took out a pistol, and without firing once, since he had not want to make a noise, finished off his victim by pistol whipping him. The room foreman in the infirmary had to deliver daily reports to those who had died in their respective rooms. An accident happened one time. At least, I know only of this one. Perhaps there were more. The room foreman confused the numbers and stated that the number which was still alive was dead, failing to report a number who really died. The report was subsequently sent to the camp's office. Fearing for his position and just for the sake of his own peace of mind, that wicked man told the patient, a Zugang, therefore not knowing what in store, to get up and stand in the queue to Claire. One dead man more, one dead man less. That mattered nothing to Claire. This way, the room foreman corrected his mistake, because both the man who died at the stab in Claire's needle and the one who died as a patient in the foreman's room were already dead. The report stated the truth, as the number of the patient who had died in the infirmary was added to it. However, we had many room foremen in the infirmary who were excellent Poles. Twice, we needed to switch the numbers, and both times it was done smoothly and without harming anyone. In the time of particularly great morality caused by typhoid fever, When corpses were removed from the blocks in vast numbers, we saved 2 of our people from the infirmary. They were serious cases. We gave them the numbers belonging to corpses and wrote their own numbers on the dead bodies in turn, making sure that these men were not charged with serious political issues. Equipped with changed personal data, surnames, first names, given to us by our fellow inmates in the camp's office, everything changed at the same time. They got to Birkenau straight from the hospital. They were completely unknown there. New numbers, Zugangs. They had successfully disappeared. The organization was growing larger and larger still. I proposed to Colonel 64, Kazimierz Heilmann, to make my colleague Major 85, Zygmunt Bohdanowski, the general military commander of the entire operation, just in case of armed action being needed. I had long anticipated this position for Major 85 back in 1940 in our underground work in Warsaw. Colonel 64 gave his consent readily. Bogdan was familiar with the local area. Many years ago, he was the commander of the 5th Horse Artillery Division. I decided, with Colonel 64's approval, to solve the plan of prospective action depending on specific objects that would have to be met. We counted 4 of them. The plan of seizing control of the camp. We wanted to have well-prepared troops in here for that end. Had to have 2 variants. One for a regular day of labor, and one for the night or a day free from work, when we would be co-opted up into blocks. The reason was that back then the commandos were not housed together yet. There were different contacts, connections, different commanders at work, different in the blocks. Because of that, we had to base our plan on outlining general objectives and design a separate action for each of them. The need arose to fill 4 positions of leaders. I had proposed Captain 60, Stanisław Kazuba, for one of them. For the second one, Captain 114, Tadeusz Paolone. For the third one, Second Lieutenant 61, Konstanty Piekarski, had suggested Lieutenant 115, identity unknown, and for the 4th one, Captain 116, Zygmunt Pawłowicz. Colonel 64, Kazimierz Heilmann, and Major 85, Zygmunt Bohdanowski, agreed to such proposals. Finally, thanks to the help of colleague 59, Henryk Bartosiewicz, and only after longer talks about the urgent need to accentuate the necessity for anonymity and remaining silent even if one of us were to be pulled to the bunker and cross-examined by the tormentors from the political department, Colonel 23, Aleksander Stawar, and Lieutenant Colonel 24, Karol Kumieniecki, join us and accept our authority. My colleague 76, Bernard Świerczyna, a first-class Polish Silesian, was very efficient in his given line of work, providing us with underwear, uniforms, sheets, and blankets from the warehouse. He also gave employment to many of our colleagues, among them one workmate from Warsaw, Lieutenant 117, Eugeniusz Zaturski, and 39, Kazimierz Radwański. Colleague 118, identity unknown, joined our ranks, and so did Sergeant 119, Józef Miksa. A colleague from my work in Warsaw, Dr. 120, Zygmunt Zakrzewski, came in a transport from Krakow. A bomb factory was discovered near Krakow at the time. Its workers were brought here and killed quickly. Dr. 120, Zygmunt Zakrzewski, somehow managed to survive. He was taken to another camp. From time to time, the camp's authorities would send informers to our organization. A Volksdeutsch, pretending to be Polish but working for Grabner, tried to detect the existence of any covert activity soon after coming to us, or even before making contact. He was identified by our colleagues who had contact with the SS man. Such a gentleman was given a few drops of croton oil added to his blood, which upset his stomach, and soon he had such gastric problems that he would run to the infirmary for help. They were already warned about the thug, and having recorded his number, they would give him a few more drops of croton oil, concealed in harmless medicine. A few days would pass, and the delinquent would be so weak that he needed to go to the infirmary again, when he would be given an injection supposedly necessary and generally harmless, if not for the fact that it was always done with a rusty needle. There were 2 such cases, which were quite thrilling. In the first case, one such gentleman had been admitted to the infirmary already. They x-rayed his lungs, and resulting photograph revealed open tuberculosis. It was, however, not his photo. Next day, when Claire was inspecting the rooms, the patient was pointed out to him as the one with TBC. That was enough. Claire wrote down his number. That man knew nothing back then, but on his way to the needle, he was spewing threats and invoking his association with Grabner. When Claire heard that foul name, he turned white, flew into rage, smashed him in the face, and finished him off quickly, so there were no Grabner threatening dissatisfied prisoners. The other case was almost identical, except the man had just been brought into the camp, knew nothing, and threatened nobody with Grabner. He met his sudden and swift end when confronted with the needle. Soon enough, however, a great commotion arose in the camp, since Grabner, who had not received a report from his informers for a long time, finally discovered that they had made their way out of the camp through the chimney quite a while earlier. On top of that, it was his own man, Claire, who had caused this demise. An investigation was launched in the infirmary that was supposed to establish how it was possible for them to be done with so quickly. Henceforth, Claire had to provide Grabner with a list of numbers he had prepared for his needle before getting to work, and Grabner would examine the list carefully, looking for his employees.